The household that claimed the girl was one that appeared ordinary from the outside, with its mud walls patched and painted to look respectable and a courtyard that always carried the smell of cooking smoke. To outsiders, it might have seemed like a place of warmth and belonging, where laughter could rise in the evenings and children might chase each other around the fire. But for the girl who lived within those walls, it was a place of shadow and cruelty. The family who had taken her in never saw her as one of their own. They treated her not as kin but as a tool to be used, a burden they could load with endless tasks while sparing themselves the slightest strain. From the moment the first rooster crowed, her day began. While the others still wrapped themselves in blankets, she was ordered to fetch water from the well that stood far beyond the compound, a task that left her shoulders aching and her hands raw from the weight of clay pots. She would return, panting, only to be greeted not with gratitude but with scolding. If a single drop spilled, if her pace seemed too slow, if the pots were not perfectly balanced at the threshold. There was no kindness in their eyes, no acknowledgement of her effort. They saw her as a beast of burden, something meant only to bend under the weight of their demands. The cruelty did not stop with labor. Every task was designed to remind her of her low place. She was forced to cook but was never allowed to eat until everyone else had finished, and by then the food was often scraps scraped from the edges of clay bowls. She washed clothes until her fingers cracked, scrubbed floors until her knees bruised, and tended the livestock even under the heat of midday sun that burned her skin red. If she faltered, if her body trembled with exhaustion, there was no mercy. They called her lazy, cursed her name, and sometimes struck her to remind her that she had no right to rest. The women of the household were the sharpest in their words. They mocked her appearance, calling her thin and weak, saying that no man would ever want someone so plain. They compared her to other girls in the village who wore bright cloths and laughed freely, and told her she was less than all of them. The men meanwhile treated her like air, unless something went wrong, in which case the blame was laid on her shoulders. If a goat went missing, it was her negligence. If the porridge was not thick enough, she had cooked it poorly. Even the smallest mishap turned into another reason to scold her, to push her deeper into silence. Children, too, learned cruelty by watching their elders. They tossed stones at her while she carried out chores, laughed when she stumbled, and repeated the insults they heard whispered over meals. Her presence became the household's favorite excuse for scorn. When tempers were high, when arguments broke out among them, they turned on her as the convenient target. Her suffering was entertainment, her pain an outlet for their frustrations. There were nights when she lay on the hard mat in the corner, her body aching from the day's labors, and wondered if this was all her life would be. She could hear the laughter of the others as they sat around the fire, eating meat and telling stories, while she was left with silence and hunger. The walls that surrounded her seemed to press closer each night, and though she longed to cry, she often bit her lip until it bled, afraid that even her tears might be mocked. The cruelty was not loud all the time. Sometimes it came in quiet, deliberate ways that cut even deeper. They would withhold small kindnesses, not letting her sit under the shade, not speaking to her except to give orders, pretending she was invisible until they needed her hands. They stole even her sense of self, making her believe that she was nothing more than the tired body that obeyed their commands. Yet despite the endless weight, there was something within her that did not break. She endured, moving from one task to the next, her silence holding more strength than they could understand. What the household failed to see was that their cruelty did not erase her spirit. Each insult, each burden, each long day bent her body but sharpened something inside her, something they would one day come to fear. But in these early years all they saw was a girl they believed weak, one who could carry their weight without protest. They mistook her endurance for helplessness, never realizing that the same silence they mocked was the silence of a storm waiting to rise. She woke before the sun, when the village was still wrapped in a heavy silence and only the faint cries of roosters echoed across the fields. Every morning she rose from her mat, her body stiff and sore, her skin bearing the red marks of the previous day's work. The household she lived in expected everything from her: water fetched before dawn, firewood gathered before the first rays touched the huts, and meals prepared before anyone else stirred. Her life was woven into an endless rhythm of servitude, and though her limbs ached, she carried out each duty without complaint. The family believed her silence was weakness, that she had no voice, no spirit strong enough to resist. Yet beneath her quiet exterior, a flame of endurance smoldered, unseen by those who mistreated her. When the elders of the household passed her, they rarely spoke, only scowled if the calabash of water she carried sloshed too much or if the grinding of the millet seemed slower than they desired. Her task stretched across the entire day. Once one was completed, another was thrust upon her shoulders. The weight of baskets, the heat of cooking fires, the sting of harsh words, all pressed into her like invisible chains. Still, she moved with a calm steadiness, her hands never faltering, her back unbent, though her heart was heavy. Each insult she swallowed like bitter roots, letting it sink inside her without outward protest. At times, when her body screamed for rest, she would slip outside during a brief pause and tilt her face to the sky. The vast blue seemed to hold her secrets, to recognize her suffering without demanding words. The breeze cooled the sweat that clung to her, and in that moment she felt herself whispering silently to the heavens. She never cursed those who harmed her. She never wished evil upon them. Instead, she asked only for strength, for the ability to rise again tomorrow, to keep walking the path laid before her. Her endurance was not of the body alone, but of the spirit, a quiet resolve that no cruelty could shatter. The family mistook her stillness for emptiness. They thought she had no fire, that she was like clay they could mold however they pleased. Yet her silence was not submission, it was a shield. She knew that words could be twisted, that resistance would only bring harsher punishments. So she carried her pain in silence, and in that silence she grew stronger. Each time they pushed her, she learned how to balance. Each time they struck her with harsh commands, she learned how to carry them without breaking. Her spirit was like a seed buried deep in the earth, unseen, yet preparing to push through the soil one day. There were nights when her heart throbbed with loneliness, when tears welled but never fell. She would lie awake, her thin blanket offering little warmth, listening to the laughter of those who had eaten well while she had gone hungry. Hunger gnawed at her belly, but she swallowed it down just as she swallowed her sorrow. In the quiet of the night, she reminded herself that endurance was her gift, her hidden power. To endure was not to be defeated, it was to outlast the storm. And storms, no matter how fierce, always passed. The children of the household mocked her too, mimicking her bowed walk, tossing pebbles at her when no elder was watching. She never struck back, never raised her voice. Instead, she kept her eyes steady and continued with her work. This quiet dignity unsettled even the cruelest among them, though they would never admit it. They wanted her broken, but her silence refused to give them that satisfaction. Even as her hands cracked from washing, as her feet blistered from carrying water jars across scorching earth, she carried herself with an inner grace. She did not shout. She did not collapse before them. She became like the mountain beyond the village, silent, unmoving, yet powerful in ways that could not be measured. Her endurance, though invisible, was unyielding. And though no one spoke of it, some began to sense it. The strange strength in her silence, the way her suffering did not destroy her but instead carved out something deeper inside. She bore each day as though it were a stone placed upon her back. The stones grew heavier, but so did her strength. And while the household believed they were breaking her, she was, in truth, shaping herself into something they could never imagine. A vessel of quiet resilience, her spirit sharpened by cruelty yet unbroken, awaiting the moment when her hidden strength would finally be revealed. The day of malice came dressed in the ordinary. The household stirred as it always did, with chores rattling from dawn until dusk, yet under the surface of the routine lingered a dark intent. They had mocked her weakness for too long, but cruelty always demands escalation, always thirsts for a more dramatic display of power. And so, whispered among them as though it were a casual joke, the idea took form, to scald her flesh with boiling water, to brand her forever as the burden they believed she was. They thought it clever, a punishment both symbolic and physical, a way to sear into her skin their dominance, and they carried the thought as though it were sport. The morning began with laughter at her expense. They told her she had scrubbed the clay pots too slowly, that she had left grain unground, that she had failed to sweep the floor with enough precision. No matter that her hands were cracked and red from endless labor, no matter that her back bent low with exhaustion, their eyes saw only her flaws. Each insult was fuel, each derisive chuckle another spark feeding the cruelty that was now swelling among them. It was not enough to command her, not enough to starve her of kindness. They wanted spectacle. They wanted her tears to amuse them. And so the pot was brought out, its iron belly heavy and blackened from years of fire. The youngest boy, eager to impress, dragged it with a squeal across the floor, and the elders looked on with narrowed eyes, their lips curling into grim smiles. Into the pot they poured water, clear at first but quickly turning clouded with dust from the jug. A woman, the sharp-tongued aunt who always found pleasure in her humiliation, stoked the fire beneath the pot, her hands practiced in cruelty as much as in cooking. Flames licked the underside with greedy hunger, and soon the room filled with a low roar, the sound of fire at work. The girl watched. She had been ordered to sit, to remain near enough so they could see her face, so they could savor the flicker of fear in her eyes. Her hands rested on her lap, though her fingers twisted in small, nervous knots, betraying the storm she held inside. She said nothing as she always did. They mistook her silence for submission, her lowered gaze for surrender. But within her heart, the silence was heavy, alive with a kind of strength they could not fathom. As the water began to heat, steam lifted from the surface in thin ribbons, curling into the air like whispers of warning. The room grew warmer, stifling, though none of them noticed. They were too consumed by the thrill of their cruelty, the anticipation of what was to come. They laughed louder, speaking of how she would flinch, how her skin would blister, how she might cry for mercy. The pot hissed as bubbles broke the surface, small at first, then growing larger, more violent, until the water rolled and surged with furious energy. The girl's breath grew shallow, her chest rising and falling as she watched the pot tremble on the fire. Her heart pounded, not with fear alone but with something sharper, harder, a refusal that had no words. For years she had endured, for years she had allowed their blows, their insults, their punishments to settle upon her without resistance. But now the fire and water seemed to hold a strange promise, as though the elements themselves were awakening, restless, unwilling to be part of this cruelty. The ant leaned closer, stirring the pot with a wooden ladle, though no food simmered within. She dipped the spoon and let the steaming liquid drip back in, a cruel demonstration of the heat that awaited the girl. "Let her learn," she hissed, her voice thick with malice. "Let her understand her place." Others nodded in agreement, their eyes bright with anticipation. The crackle of fire was drowned by their laughter, and the girl sat in the center of their scorn like a shadow, quiet, still, yet unbroken. Every second stretched into an eternity. The fire spat sparks, the pot groaned, and the steam grew thicker, cloaking the air in an invisible warning. The girl, still silent, lifted her eyes for the briefest moment, and though her face remained calm, her gaze touched the bubbling surface with an intensity that unsettled the room, if only for an instant. But their cruelty blinded them. They saw only their plan, their entertainment, their victory about to unfold. The pot was ready now, the water churning with violence. One of the men grabbed a cloth, preparing to lift it from the fire. The heat stung his hands even through the fabric, but he gritted his teeth, eager to carry out the act. The others gathered around, their shadows dancing on the walls, their laughter echoing off the clay. The girl's heart pounded louder, yet her lips remained sealed. The moment was here, teetering on the edge of horror as the boiling pot drew to its peak. The pot trembled as though the fire beneath it fed not only heat but hatred itself. The bubbling water snapped and hissed, its furious sounds filling the room like a warning that went unheeded. The family gathered around, eyes sharp with malice, their voices lowered yet soaked in venom. They spoke of punishment, of teaching her a lesson she would never forget, and the sight of their eager hands reaching for the pot betrayed their excitement at the suffering they were about to unleash. For them, her silence had become unbearable. Her quiet endurance, which they mistook for weakness, gnawed at their pride. To see her bent but never broken angered them more than anything. And so they chose cruelty of the purest kind, one that would scar not only her skin but, they believed, her spirit. The girl stood at the center of the room, her head slightly bowed, her frail frame surrounded by shadows that seemed to lean in close. She did not speak, did not plead. There was no frantic motion, no begging for mercy. Her lips remained sealed, but her eyes shimmered with something untouchable, a calmness that only deepened their cruelty. To them, that quiet strength was arrogance. They wanted her to wail, to fight, to crumble before them, but her silence held. And as the water boiled harder, popping like tiny explosions, the tension in the air thickened. The eldest of them stepped forward, gripping the pot with a cloth, his arms taut with both strain and anticipation. Steam licked his face and yet he smiled. He lifted the pot slowly, deliberately, as though savoring the moment. Others leaned forward, lips curled in cruel delight, their eyes hungry to watch her flesh blister and her voice break into desperate screams. Time itself seemed to stretch, each heartbeat echoing like a drumbeat of dread. The pot tilted, and the shimmering violent surface of the water revealed its rage. The scalding stream fell upon her. The hiss of boiling water striking skin filled the air, sharp and violent, like 100 snakes uncoiling at once. The household stiffened, waiting for the inevitable cry. But no scream came. Not a whimper, not even a gasp. Instead, there was only the sound of water spattering against the floor, the rising rush of steam climbing higher than expected, curling and twisting in the air. The girl did not fall. She did not clutch her skin in agony. She stood, her figure straight, her eyes forward. Her lips parted, but no sound emerged, only a soft breath that mingled with the vapor rising around her. And that vapor, strange and alive, seemed to resist dispersing. It gathered, thick and white, forming delicate patterns that startled the onlookers. The steam spiraled upward, not chaotically but as though it carried intent. Faces seemed to flicker within it, ancient outlines with eyes that glowed faintly before dissolving. Whispers rode on the mist, faint at first but unmistakable. They did not come from her, nor from any human throat. The voices sounded like echoes of old rivers, like winds trapped in caves, chanting low and rhythmic words the family could not understand. Panic stirred among them, yet they were rooted to the floor, unable to move, their cruel delight shriveling into fear. The water dripped from her skin as though it had lost its heat before it ever touched her. Where it had splashed, no scars formed, no burns marred her flesh. She remained unscathed, her skin pale and luminous beneath the dim light. The mist thickened around her shoulders, rising like a cloak, shielding her, protecting her. And all the while, her silence remained, heavier than their fear, sharper than any scream could have been. One of them stuttered, trying to laugh it off, but the sound died in his throat as the vapor coiled toward him, brushing his cheek with a sting of coldness that felt unnatural. Another staggered back, muttering about omens, about spirits called by accident. Their cruelty, once afire, was now extinguished by dread. For in their act of malice, they had unleashed something far beyond their comprehension. The girl's eyes lifted then, and for the first time she met their gaze directly. She did not smile, did not gloat. But in the reflection of the steam that surrounded her, her gaze seemed multiplied, as though dozens of unseen eyes glared through her. The silence stretched until the only sound left was the faint drip of water cooling on the floor, a reminder of what should have been unbearable pain, now transformed into a shield of mystery. They had poured boiling water expecting screams and disfigurement. Instead, they were met with a moment that defied their world, a moment when cruelty backfired, and the air itself seemed to rise in her defense. And as the steam thickened and the whispers grew louder, they realized too late that they had not punished her. They had awakened something that would not be silenced. The steam rose like a living thing, thick and swirling, hissing as though it had teeth. For a heartbeat, the villagers thought the girl would collapse, her skin peeling away, her screams echoing across the compound. They had imagined her broken, shriveled, crawling to their feet like a dog. But instead, she stood rooted to the earth, her frame trembling only slightly, not from pain, but from the force of something none of them could comprehend. The boiling water had touched her, yet it did not scald. Instead, the very air around her erupted with vapor, a cloud so dense and furious that it seemed to grow from her body. The steam wrapped her like a cloak, curling and snapping in the air, its edges jagged like knives. Then the miracle or curse unfolded. The cloud recoiled from her skin and lunged outward. It reached for those who had gathered to watch, their sneering faces and expectant smirks frozen in shock. The first scream split the silence. One of the women clutching the pot staggered back, dropping the handle as the steam clawed at her face. Blisters formed instantly, bubbling across her cheeks as if fire lived beneath her skin. Another tried to turn, to run, but the vapor caught him like a predator. It slid over his arms, biting into his flesh with invisible teeth. He shrieked, slapping at himself, his skin red and raw, the boils swelling where the mist touched. The more they swatted, the deeper the burns grew, as though resistance only fed the fury. The girl did not move. Her head lifted slightly and her eyes, calm and strange, looked through the mist. The steam seemed to answer her, coiling tighter, denser, glowing faintly in the afternoon light. It was not simply water turned to vapor. It was alive, animated by something ancient, something beyond human cruelty. Those who had come to watch her humiliation backed away. Mothers snatched their children, dragging them from the edge of the gathering. The older men muttered prayers, clutching their amulets, their beads, their charms. They could not believe what they were seeing, yet they could not deny it either. The ones who had plotted her torment were not so fortunate. The steam chose them. One boy, no older than 17, who had laughed the loudest when they heated the pot, now fell to his knees. The mist spiraled around his hands, blistering his palms as if he had grasped hot iron. He howled, pounding the ground, begging for release. Another woman, who had whispered, "Let her scream so the village knows her weakness," now found her throat scorched raw with every breath, as though the very air she inhaled burned her from the inside. She clawed at her neck, her eyes rolling with terror, while the mist refused to let her go. The crowd's laughter had turned to chaos. The steam raged, hissing louder, almost like a song, no, like a wail. It echoed through the compound, a sound that seemed to come not from water, but from spirits long silenced. Some swore they saw faces in the vapor, hollow eyes, grim mouths, ancestral forms rising to avenge the girl. The mist moved with purpose, sweeping left, right, striking at each tormentor one by one, never faltering, never touching the innocent who only watched in stunned horror. Through it all she remained untouched. Her hair, damp with vapor, clung to her skin but no burns appeared. Her dress was soaked, yet her body radiated a strange glow as though light itself bent toward her. She stood in the heart of the storm like a queen in her court, her silence more terrifying than any scream she could have given. The tormentors began to collapse, writhing in the dust. Their cries were no longer cruel, no longer triumphant. They begged. They pleaded. Some tried to crawl toward her feet, hoping that if they touched her, if they showed submission, the vapor would relent. But the mist lashed out, burning their hands before they could reach her. It was not her mercy they were denied, it was justice that would not be silenced. The elders, trembling, could not contain their fear. "This is no ordinary girl," one whispered, his voice hoarse. "The ancestors have clothed her. The spirits have chosen her." Another spat into the ground, trembling. "We have angered something greater than us. This is punishment." Punishment indeed, for every boil that rose on their skins, for every cry that echoed into the air, was a reflection of the cruelty they had inflicted. Where they had hoped for her screams, they screamed instead. Where they had dreamed of her scars, their own bodies bore the wounds. And the girl, she simply breathed, her chest rising and falling, her eyes closing as if in quiet communion with the mist. It lasted longer than anyone thought possible. Minutes stretched like hours as the cloud tormented the guilty, blister after blister, wail after wail. Some fainted from pain, their bodies curling like dried leaves. Others staggered, blinded, clawing at their own burned faces. Finally, as if satisfied, the steam began to thin. The air cooled, the mist drifting upward into the sky. Slowly, shapes disappeared, dissolving into nothing but harmless vapor, leaving behind the aftermath of its wrath. The pot lay shattered on the ground, water spilling uselessly into the dust. Silence fell. The girl stood alone in the center, her body unharmed, her face serene, though her eyes shone with unshed tears, not of weakness, but of a strength she could no longer hide. Around her, the cruel ones groaned, scarred, their power stripped away. No one dared speak against her again. For in that moment, she was no longer merely the girl they had sought to break. She was a vessel of something greater, a reminder that cruelty always births its own punishment. And as the villagers looked upon her, trembling, one thought grew in every heart: the mist would not forgive them if they ever dared touch her again. She walked away, slowly, her steps soft, her dignity intact. The ground seemed to hush beneath her feet. And behind her, the broken cries of her oppressors faded into the dust, swallowed by the silence of their own defeat. The next morning, the village was not as it had been. It carried with it the scent of boiled water and the strange heaviness of steam that lingered even though the air was clear. People walked in hushed tones, glancing over their shoulders as though the mist itself might reappear and wrap around them. No one spoke openly of what had happened, but the whispers were already alive, darting from mouth to ear like quick-footed spirits. "They say she did not scream," muttered a woman grinding maize by her hut. Her companion leaned closer, eyes wide. "Not even once? But boiling water, it peels flesh. It destroys." Yet she stood as though nothing touched her. Another group gathered near the well, pitchers balanced on their hips. They spoke in low voices, yet each word carried sharp weight. "The steam rose like a wall," one said. "It moved as though it had its own mind. Did you not hear? It clung to the men, burned their arms, blistered their faces, yet she was whole. Untouched." "Blessed," someone whispered. "Cursed," another spat quickly as if afraid the word itself would draw the mist back. By midday the story had stretched and twisted, becoming larger than the truth it carried. Some said the girl had called upon hidden spirits, that her quiet suffering had awakened ancestors who wrapped her in protection. Others claimed she had bartered her soul to forces unseen, and that the mist was not protection but a warning of the darkness she carried. In the market, as people traded grain for cloth and fish for salt, the tale became part of every bargain. "Careful how you treat her," one man cautioned, lowering his voice. "Those who mocked her have swollen skin now, blistered like roasted groundnuts. Do you want the same fate?" His words were met with nervous laughter, though no one dared to deny him. Children, ever braver in their curiosity, whispered the loudest. They dared each other to walk near her hut, to peek inside when she stepped out to fetch water. Some swore that steam followed her wherever she went, rising from the ground at her feet, though none could say for certain. They said if you listened closely, the mist whispered too, ancient words no living tongue could understand. The elders gathered in the council hut, faces drawn and voices uncertain. They were men who had once believed themselves above fear, yet their eyes betrayed unease. "We must decide what this means," one of them declared, though his voice wavered. "If she is cursed, she will bring ruin upon us all." Another elder shook his head slowly. "Or perhaps she is chosen. There have always been signs. Spirits do not act without reason. Maybe her suffering was not hers alone, but a test for us, and we have failed." But not all agreed. Some clenched their fists and insisted she was a danger, that no human body could withstand such fire unless it was touched by something unholy. Others argued in softer tones that what had happened was justice, that cruelty had turned upon the cruel, and she was not to be feared but honored. So the village split. Some began leaving small offerings near her path, calabashes of milk, beads, sprigs of herbs known to ward off evil. They bowed their heads as she passed, not meeting her eyes, yet silently pleading for her protection. Others, though, avoided her altogether. They crossed the street when she approached, shut their doors when she fetched water, and whispered prayers under their breath. Mothers pulled their children closer, warning them not to stare too long, not to say her name at night when the air was heavy with dew. She, however, remained quiet. She neither asked for offerings nor cursed those who shunned her. She walked the village paths with the same steady step as before, carrying her pitcher, tending her small tasks. But now, wherever she went, silence followed. And at night, the whispers deepened. The wind that moved through the huts seemed thicker, heavier. Some swore that when the moonlight touched her doorway, a thin veil of mist coiled around it, as though guarding her sleep. Others claimed they heard voices in the steam, gentle and mournful, like ancestors singing from the other side. Fear and awe grew together, tangled like vines that could not be separated. The villagers no longer looked at her as they once did, with contempt or pity. Now they looked with eyes that widened in wonder and narrowed in suspicion. She had become something else entirely, no longer just a girl, no longer merely a victim. She had become a story. A living tale that children repeated at night, that elders argued over by firelight, and that every whisper seemed to make larger than life. Whether cursed or blessed, no one could agree. But all knew one thing: she was no longer to be touched, no longer to be mocked, no longer to be treated as ordinary. The steam had marked her, and through her, the whole village. Her days no longer begin with the shadow of fear pressing on her chest. Where once she walked with her head bowed, shoulders heavy beneath the weight of shame and cruelty, now her steps carried a firmness that startled even herself. It was not pride that shaped her new bearing, nor arrogance, but a quiet force that had been born in the mist that spared her. She carried within her an undeniable shift, something that could not be unseen by those who had once reduced her to nothing. The villagers who used to sneer and mock her now glanced over their shoulders when she passed, lowering their voices as if afraid her ears could catch their words and twist them into curses. She had not spoken against them, had not raised her hand to punish them, yet her silence carried a gravity that unsettled them more than shouts ever could. Her transformation was not only in the way others perceived her, it was in the marrow of her bones. She felt no hunger for vengeance, no fire of retribution burning her heart to ashes. Instead, she felt a stillness, a strange calm that made her more unshakable than stone. Her pain had not vanished, it lingered as memories, etched like scars upon her soul, but the pain no longer ruled her. It had turned into something else: strength, a kind of armor invisible to the eye yet heavier than any shield. Each insult she had endured, every cruelty they had forced upon her, had melted into a substance that no hand could touch, no weapon could pierce. Those who once laughed when she entered the marketplace now moved aside, as though her presence carved a path of its own. Some did it out of respect, others out of fear. Whispers trailed behind her steps, soft, uncertain whispers that could not agree whether she was favored by spirits or carrying a curse meant to strike down anyone who dared to harm her. Yet in those whispers lay an unspoken acknowledgement: she was no longer the fragile one they thought they could crush. She had become something beyond their reach. Children who once mocked her behind their mother's skirts now watched her with wide, curious eyes, as though she glowed with a secret light. Women who had once thrown sharp words her way hushed themselves in her presence, remembering the mist that had burned others but left her untouched. Men who had believed her powerless now shifted uneasily if she came too near, their bravado collapsing under the weight of their own guilt. They could not reconcile the girl they had poured boiling water upon with the woman who now walked unharmed, carrying no scars where their malice had aimed to brand her forever. But the change was not only external, it grew inside her too. She no longer trembled at the sound of angered voices, nor shrank from harsh gazes. Her hands, which once fidgeted and clutched themselves in helplessness, now rested calmly at her sides. Her breath came steady, even when others sought to provoke her with doubtful looks. And when she spoke, her words carried a weight they had never known before. People leaned in to hear her, not because her voice was loud, but because it carried a strange authority born from surviving what should have destroyed her. Yet she did not wield this newfound strength carelessly. She did not walk through the village demanding apologies or retribution. Her silence and her serenity did the work for her. Where once they had tried to strip her of dignity, she now carried dignity so unshakable that it exposed their own pettiness and cruelty. Her calmness mirrored back to them their violence, their malice, their smallness. They could not escape it. To look at her was to be reminded of what they had done, and of the spirits, or fate or destiny, that had chosen to protect her. The marketplace, once a battlefield of mockery and shame, became a stage where her transformation was most visible. She would walk among the stalls, her hands grazing the fabrics, her eyes lifting to the sky, her movements unhurried. People gave her space as though she were sacred. Traders, who once might have cheated her or shoved her aside, now softened their tones, offering her better prices or slipping extra into her baskets. It was not generosity, it was appeasement, a quiet attempt to keep themselves safe from whatever unseen force they believed guarded her. In her solitude she came to understand something deeper. Power was not always about commanding others or forcing them to bend. Real power, she realized, was the refusal to be broken. They had tried to burn her, to scar her body and silence her spirit, but the mist had turned their cruelty back upon them. And in the aftermath she discovered a truth that few ever did, that the soul, once hardened by survival and quiet endurance, becomes unyielding. It cannot be bent, no matter the weight placed upon it. At night, when she walked beneath the stars, she would feel the strength in her stride and the freedom in her chest. She was no longer the same girl who once begged for kindness or cried alone in hidden corners. She was something else now, untouchable, unafraid. And though the villagers could not name what she had become, they recognized it when they saw her. It was written in the way they lowered their eyes, in the way their voices faltered when she passed, in the way respect and fear mingled in every step they took to avoid crossing her. She had been reborn not in fire but in steam. Not through vengeance but through survival. And as the days passed, the woman she became stood as a reminder to all. Cruelty may attempt to destroy, but sometimes, it only forges. The cruel ones did not recover easily. Their skin, once smooth and unmarked, now bore the furious testimony of their malice. Blisters, hardened and angry, traced along their arms, hands and faces, silent yet screaming evidence of the night the boiling water and the living steam had turned against them. No ointment, no cooling herb, no prayers whispered into the night could erase the marks. Each time they looked into a reflective surface, each time sunlight caught the raised, angry skin on their hands, they were reminded of the punishment their cruelty had invoked. The youngest boy, who had laughed the loudest, now hid behind the walls of his home, refusing to appear in public. When neighbors approached, he flinched, twisting his blistered hands as if they carried messages written in pain. His voice, once loud and teasing, had shrunk to a trembling whisper, barely audible above the rustle of leaves outside his window. Even his own family treated him differently, aware that he bore the shame of what had been done, both to the girl and to himself. The woman who had stoked the fire beneath the pot fared no better. Her face was a mosaic of scars and blisters, some still raw, others hardened like the bark of an old tree. When she spoke, her words came out with a rasp, and every gesture of her hands reminded her of the fury she had invoked. She avoided the marketplace now, preferring to send others in her place, fearful of the eyes that might catch her, fearful of the whispers that always followed. Even in her own home, she could not escape judgment. The villagers had not forgotten, and the stories of her suffering circulated in hushed tones, every mention adding weight to her shame. The men, the elder brothers who had urged the act of cruelty, lived in similar terror. They tried to walk as though nothing had happened, attempting the same authority they had once wielded, but their movements were stiff, cautious, as though their bodies had learned to avoid attention. They avoided her path, lowered their eyes in her presence, and spoke in muted tones when her name was mentioned. They carried their guilt like heavy stones in their chests, yet it was their bodies that bore the constant reminder, and that reminder was more eloquent than any confession could be. Even when they thought themselves alone, the fear lingered. A shadow might cross a wall, and they flinched, thinking of the mist rising around her, of the strange whispering that had accompanied their punishment. Every sound in the wind, every curling tendril of smoke from a cooking fire, seemed to carry the memory of that night. They imagined the steam lurking, waiting, poised to strike again if they dared even a small act of cruelty. Sleep became shallow and fleeting. Nightmares returned with relentless persistence, each one replaying the moment of the boiling water, the rising mist, and the girl untouched amidst their suffering. Attempts to heal the marks were futile. Healers and wise women applied balms, wrapped their blisters in cloth, and muttered prayers over them, but nothing could remove the memory of the pain. The skin could mend partially, but the deeper lesson of the night, the consequence of their malice, remained embedded in every nerve, every scar, every reflection they glimpsed in water or polished metal. Their bodies spoke in language they could not escape, and the village watched quietly, the story circulating like smoke from countless hearths. The shame of their own weakness gnawed at them too. They had thought to humiliate, to dominate, to reduce a quiet girl to tears and cries, but the lesson they received was sharper than fire. Each blister was not merely a wound, but a story written by the elements themselves, a narrative of justice that left them powerless. They could hide, they could retreat to their homes, but the memory and the mark traveled with them. It clung to them like a shadow, whispering of accountability and the unseen consequences of cruelty. They avoided her path. They passed her at a distance, heads bowed, whispers fading to silence as she approached. If they could have erased her presence from their eyes, they would have. Yet she moved among them as though untouched by either their malice or their fear, calm and measured, her dignity intact. And it was this very contrast, the radiant calm of the one they tried to harm against the trembling guilt of those who had, that made the lesson permanent. Even in their homes, their families noticed the change. Children avoided the ones with blistered hands, adults spoke less loudly in their presence. There was a collective recognition that the punishment had not only scarred their skin but also diminished their stature within the community. Friends who had once laughed with them, who had joined in the mockery, now kept their distance. The cruel ones had become isolated, imprisoned not in walls but in their own shame and fear. The village learned quickly to respect her space and her strength. Even those who had been uninvolved felt the weight of her power, and their caution shaped the rhythms of daily life. They whispered stories of what had occurred, embellishing the tale in a way that heightened the fear of cruelty. Mothers warned children, elders spoke in low tones at council meetings, traders mentioned it at the market, all reinforcing the lesson. And so the cruel ones lived under constant vigilance, not by others, but by the memory of the justice they had invoked upon themselves. They became shadows of their former selves, wary of their own hands, haunted by the steam that had struck them while leaving the girl untouched. In every glance, every movement, every attempt at ordinary life, they carried the undeniable proof of their folly. Their fear was both private and public, visible and invisible, a mark of their own making that no remedy could erase. In time, even the harshest of their whispers turned to cautionary tales. They were reminders to themselves and to others. Cruelty carries its own punishment, and strength lies not only in endurance but in the unseen forces that watch over those who suffer with dignity. And though they survived, though their lives continued, they did so with the steady, inescapable reminder of their own fear. The village slowly began to change, though not all at once. The echoes of that night lingered in every hut, every marketplace, every path worn between homes. People moved more cautiously now, aware that cruelty no longer went unpunished and that strength often hid where it was least expected. Mothers, once indifferent or scolding too harshly, now paused before raising their voices at their children. Fathers, who had turned blind eyes to injustice or encouraged mockery, now found themselves second-guessing every word. The story of the girl and the boiling water had traveled fast, and its lesson was unavoidable. Even the smallest act of malice carried consequences far beyond one's imagination. Some villagers approached the girl cautiously, heads lowered, hands folded. They spoke in tones hushed and respectful, apologizing for past mockery, for turning their eyes away when she suffered, for believing that cruelty could ever go unnoticed. "We were wrong," they said, voices trembling. "Forgive us. We did not understand." She accepted their apologies with quiet grace, not with anger or condescension, but with the dignity that had always belonged to her. There was no rejoicing in her victim's repentance, only the calm acknowledgement that justice, unseen and mysterious, had shifted the balance of the village. The elders, who had once relied solely on tradition to guide behavior, now saw the need to teach restraint and respect, especially to the young. Lessons about fairness, patience, and the dangers of cruelty became part of every story told at dusk. Children gathered around the evening fires to hear not just tales of the girl, but also the consequences faced by those who had sought to harm her. The story was told over and over, shaping the moral compass of the next generation, instilling awe and caution in equal measure. Even tradesmen and merchants began to adjust their behavior. Where once they might have snubbed the weak, cut corners, or taken advantage of those less fortunate, they now treated everyone with careful attention. Not out of mere politeness, but from the knowledge that unseen forces might be at work, that the world had ways of correcting imbalance, and that respect and justice were more powerful than fear or cruelty. In the marketplaces, the whispers turned into open conversation. People spoke about fairness in dealings, kindness in speech, and protection for those who could not defend themselves. Mothers reminded their children that mocking or harming someone weaker could bring consequences beyond human comprehension. Fathers taught caution, warning that no one could predict the strength hidden in a quiet soul, or the power of forces unseen that might protect them. Yet, not all embraced this change willingly. Some resisted, clinging to old arrogance and habits. They avoided the girls still, whispering warnings to each other in fear that even proximity could summon punishment. But even they, over time, adjusted. Fear tempered them, yes, but it also taught humility. They began to recognize that strength is not always obvious and that cruelty never truly goes unnoticed. The community, in collective reflection, began reshaping its values. Acts of charity became more common. Neighbors helped each other without waiting for instruction or reward. The weak and the overlooked were no longer dismissed but treated with care and consideration. It was a subtle shift, almost imperceptible at first, but over months and years the village's culture transformed. What had once been a place where mockery and malice thrived now leaned toward fairness, respect, and vigilance against cruelty. Some sought Nura's guidance directly, asking her to share lessons of endurance and dignity. She did so quietly, never speaking with anger or boasting about her survival. Her example, more than her words, became the moral compass for the village. People watched her, learning that true strength does not shout but remains steadfast, that dignity persists even in the face of suffering, and that cruelty always finds its own reckoning. The memory of the boiling water and the mist remained a constant, unspoken presence. Children grew up fearing the consequences of malice, learning that justice might not always be immediate, but it was inevitable. They learned to honor the quiet, the patient, the resilient. And the adults, having witnessed the strange and terrifying protection that had shielded the girl, became more deliberate in their actions. Words were weighed carefully, hands restrained, and hearts softened. In the end, the village did not merely apologize, it transformed. The reckoning was not a single moment but a continuous shift, a reordering of priorities and values. The girl who had once suffered in silence now stood at the center, not as a ruler or tyrant, but as a living example of the consequences of cruelty and the enduring power of integrity. She had not demanded obedience, yet she had earned it. She had not sought vengeance, yet justice had followed its course. Through whispers, through careful teaching, and through a change in daily life, the village slowly learned to respect what had once been trampled. They understood that the weak are not always defenseless, that patience carries its own strength, and that unseen forces often watch over those who endure with courage. And in this transformation the girl's presence became sacred, a reminder, a lesson, and a living symbol of justice.